The week my father co-signed a six-figure lease for his Golden Boys gym, he refused me under $4,000 to save my apartment and job. I did not beg. I simply vanished, realizing some families only want you around to clean up their wreckage. 18 months later, the bank called my parents instead of my brother. The daughter they told to be independent was now the only one cold enough to decide who gets saved and who stands alone. My name is Monica Fairchild. I am 34 years old, and if you drove past the house where I grew up, located in a perfectly manicured, aggressively quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio, you would think we were the poster family for the American dream. We had the giant oak trees lining the sidewalk, the pristine concrete driveway, and the carefully painted white shutters. Inside, we had my father, Douglas Fairchild, a man whose emotional distance masqueraded as strong moral principle. We had my mother, Evelyn Fairchild, a woman whose soft, soothing voice perfectly camouflaged a deep, unwavering bias. And then, at the absolute center of our familial solar system, pulling all the gravity, warmth, and light toward himself, was my younger brother, Wyatt. From the time I was old enough to tie my own shoes and pack my own lunch, I understood that this house operated on a silent, ironclad set of rules. The most fundamental law was simple. Wyatt was an investment, while I was an expectation. If Wyatt threw a massive tantrum because his dinner was cold, or if he cried because his middle school homework was too hard, the entire household mobilized to soothe his distress. My mother would flutter around him with warm milk, snacks, and endless patience, while my father would offer gruff but indulgent pep talks about unlocking his potential. On the other hand, if I was overwhelmed or exhausted, I simply closed my bedroom door and dealt with it alone. My silence was never investigated. It was merely categorized as "Monica is fine," a highly convenient label that completely absolved my parents of having to actually parent me. Fairness in the Fairchild household was just a polite, sanitized word for extreme favoritism. The disparity was not always screamed across the living room. Mostly, it was a quiet, daily erosion of my worth. I remember the spring I was 14. I had spent 6 grueling months preparing for a regional academic decathlon. I won first place in 2 difficult categories and brought home a heavy, polished mahogany plaque. I placed it right on the kitchen island next to my father's coffee mug, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for him to finally see me. When he came home from his corporate job, he picked it up, read the brass plate, gave a single, brief nod, and said, "Good job keeping your grades up." He put it face down on the counter and went into the den to watch the evening news. That exact same year, Wyatt played in the local junior baseball league. He was objectively terrible. He spent the entire spring season striking out, missing routine fly balls, and occasionally throwing his leather glove into the dirt in a fit of dramatic rage. When his team finished dead last in the county, my parents did not just pat his back and tell him to practice more. They packed us all into the family sedan and took us out for a massive celebratory dinner at the most expensive Italian restaurant in town. My mother ordered him a gigantic ice cream sundae, stroking his hair while he sulked in the booth. My father raised his glass of iced tea and gave a passionate toast. "To Wyatt," he said, beaming with an inexplicable pride. Because the boy is trying, and trying is what makes a man, I sat across the table, eating my plain pasta, realizing with sharp clarity that my absolute best was barely worth a nod, but his spectacular failure warranted a feast. The gap between us only widened as we grew older and the stakes became strictly financial. When I was 16, I desperately wanted to learn how to manage spreadsheets and understand basic bookkeeping. I had a vision for my future that required hard skills, not just good high school grades. I sat my parents down in the dining room and presented a carefully researched proposal to buy a refurbished, second-hand laptop. It was a modest request, costing only a couple of $100s. My parents exchanged a weary, practiced look. My father sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose, and said, "Money is tight right now, Monica. We have to be practical. You just need to wait a bit. You can use the library computers after school. I swallowed my bitter disappointment, accepted their financial reasoning, and spent 2 hours every single afternoon walking in the cold to the public library to practice typing and data entry. I genuinely thought I was doing the noble, mature thing by sacrificing my comfort for the family budget. 3 months later, a loud, rumbling engine woke me up on a Saturday morning. I looked out my second-story bedroom window and saw a bright red, lifted Jeep Cherokee parked awkwardly in our driveway. It was used, but it was massive, loud, and undeniably expensive. Wyatt was jumping up and down on the front lawn while my father proudly tossed him the heavy metal keys. I walked downstairs, feeling completely hollowed out, and found my mother pouring coffee in the kitchen. I asked her how we could suddenly afford a truck for a 16-year-old boy when we could not afford a used computer for school. She did not even have the grace to look guilty. She simply offered a warm, maternal smile and said, "Oh, honey, you know how high school is. A boy needs a car to be more confident. It is an investment in his self-esteem." My father was the master architect of the verbal cages that kept us locked in our respective places. He had a habit of repeating these stoic, seemingly empowering slogans to me, which were actually just convenient ways to deny me any real support. Whenever I faced a hurdle, whether it was figuring out how to pay for my own standardized tests or navigating a vicious conflict with a teacher, he would look at me with a stern, approving gaze and say, "You are the strong one, Monica." Or he would cross his arms, lean back in his recliner, and declare, "A girl has to know how to take care of herself in this world." He framed my total isolation as a compliment. Yet, that rugged philosophy completely vanished into thin air the moment Wyatt encountered a minor inconvenience. For my brother, my father's entire vocabulary shifted. When Wyatt wrecked the expensive Jeep by backing straight into a brick mailbox, or when he completely failed sophomore math, my father's booming voice would soften into endless grace. "He just needs one more chance," my father would argue, pacing the living room floor while rubbing his chin. "The boy is finding his footing. We cannot give up on him." If this were a movie, that would be the part where the neglected teenage daughter dyes her hair jet black, starts screaming obscenities at the dinner table, and rebels against the corrupt system. But real life in the American suburbs is rarely that dramatic. I did not become a wild rebel. Instead, I morphed into the quintessential, invisible daughter of a deeply biased family. I became impeccably neat. I became relentlessly reasonable. I learned to ask for absolutely nothing. I managed my own complex schedule, did my own laundry every Sunday, forged my own permission slips for field trips, and taught myself how to sew my own torn hems. I built an entire personality around the desperate desire to never be viewed as a burden, because I knew, deep down in my bones, that there was no room in my parents' emotional bandwidth for my needs. The space was completely occupied by my brother. There was only one person in my entire childhood who looked at our family dynamic and saw it for the absolute robbery it truly was. My maternal grandmother, Ruth, was a sharp-tongued, observant woman who visited us on major holidays. She did not say much in front of my parents, but she watched everything. She saw the way my mother instinctively served Wyatt the largest, thickest portions of meat at dinner. She saw the way my father constantly interrupted my stories to ask Wyatt about his mundane video games. One Thanksgiving, when I was 17, I was standing in the kitchen washing the massive pile of greasy dishes while everyone else watched football in the living room. Grandma Ruth walked in, carrying a checkered drying towel. She did not offer to help wash. Instead, she reached deep into her wool cardigan pocket, pulled out a folded $20 bill, and shoved it roughly into the front pocket of my denim jeans. I tried to hand it back immediately, whispering that I did not need it, that I was perfectly fine. She grabbed my wrist, her bony grip surprisingly strong for an old woman, and looked me dead in the eye. "Buy your books, Monica," she whispered fiercely, "and listen to me carefully. Do not let anyone turn your calmness into an excuse to forget you." That single sentence stayed burned in my mind for the rest of my life. It was the only shred of validation I ever received under that roof. As I packed my cardboard boxes to leave that house for good after my high school graduation, I looked back at the living room where my parents were laughing loudly at something Wyatt had just said. I realized then the exact devastating nature of my childhood. I did not grow up in grinding poverty. I did not grow up with physical violence or explosive, shattered glass on the floor. I grew up in something much quieter, much more insidious, and much harder to explain to a therapist. I grew up with the cold, sterile trauma of being the child who is forced to always be understanding, always be capable, and always be self-sufficient. And because of that forced capability, I was taught the absolute hardest lesson a daughter can ever learn. If you do not desperately need to be saved, you will never, ever be the priority. I moved out exactly 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. There was no tearful goodbye in the driveway, no loaded station wagon packed with dorm room essentials, no ceremonial passing of a mini fridge or a crisp $100 bill for emergencies. I packed 2 faded duffel bags, signed a lease on a cramped studio apartment that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and industrial carpet cleaner, and went straight to work. I understood the cold, hard math of my existence very clearly. No one in that house was going to underwrite my future. I spent my days sitting behind a particle board desk in the windowless lobby of Alder Row Services. I answered phones, organized vendor invoices, and sorted mail for $14 an hour. It was mind-numbing work, but it paid the electric bill. At night, I sat under a flickering fluorescent bulb in the back row of community college classrooms. I was grinding through dense textbooks to earn my professional certificates in operational accounting and compliance management. I drank terrible black coffee until my stomach burned and color-coded my study guides until my vision blurred at 2 in the morning. I was building a fortress around myself, brick by boring, exhausting brick. I knew that without a degree from a fancy university, my only currency was absolute, undeniable competence. Eventually, I leveraged those hard-earned certificates into a mid-level administrative role at Granite Mutual Processing. From there, I kept my head down, volunteered for the tedious projects no one else wanted, and climbed the invisible, unglamorous ladder until I became a contract records control specialist. My daily job was to scour 50-page vendor agreements to find hidden liabilities and operational risks. It was a dry, meticulous, and entirely safe profession. It was the exact career you choose when you know you do not have a safety net waiting to catch you if you fall. While I was spending my weekends highlighting indemnity clauses and reconciling corporate ledgers, my brother Wyatt was living an entirely different, highly subsidized American experience. Wyatt changed his life trajectory and career goals faster than most people change their bedsheets. For 6 agonizing months, he was a self-proclaimed entrepreneur, selling questionable dietary supplements and protein powders online out of his apartment living room. When the inventory expired and his business credit cards maxed out at $25,000, my parents quietly paid the balance to save his credit score. Then, he pivoted to becoming a luxury used car broker, a chaotic venture that ended abruptly with a massive lawsuit threat from a disgruntled buyer who received a broken engine. My father immediately hired a pricey defense attorney to make the whole mess quietly disappear. Then came the era of Wyatt the fitness visionary, the phase that would ultimately break the camel's back. I never felt a burning, green-eyed jealousy over the actual dollar amounts they handed him. The money was just paper and digital numbers shifting between accounts. What slowly eroded my spirit and hardened my heart was the underlying message baked into every single bailed-out scheme. When Wyatt crashed and burned, it was treated as a tragic, unforeseen emergency requiring immediate financial and emotional mobilization from my parents. When I worked a 60-hour week, fought off a blinding tension headache, and paid my own rent without a single late fee, it was treated as the bare minimum requirement for existing. His spectacular failures were endlessly coddled. My exhausting survival was simply expected. The very first person to ever see this dynamic clearly and say it out loud to me was Eli. Eli Mercer was a high school guidance counselor. I met at a mutual friend's incredibly dull birthday dinner party. He possessed a calm, deeply intelligent demeanor and a dry, deadpan sense of humor that immediately anchored my anxious mind. Eli did not want a chaotic, fiery, unpredictable romance. He loved the quiet certainty I offered. He loved that I kept my promises, paid my bills early, and navigated life with a steady hand. He was the safe harbor I had been searching for since I was a child. About 8 months into our relationship, Eli and I were sitting on the floor by my secondhand sofa, folding a massive pile of warm laundry. I was casually recounting how my father had just spent his entire weekend helping Wyatt move out of a luxury downtown apartment he could no longer afford, packing boxes and hiring a moving truck on his own dime. I was not complaining, just stating the mundane facts of my family's weekend. Eli stopped folding a white towel, looked at me with his dark, steady eyes, and dismantled my entire worldview in one devastating sentence. "They are not praising your independence, Monica," Eli said softly, his voice devoid of any judgment but heavy with truth. "They have weaponized it. They use your extreme competence as an excuse to completely ignore you, so they can pour absolutely all their energy and resources into the son who refuses to grow up." I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to fiercely defend my parents and my rugged, hard-won self-reliance, but the truth of his words rang so loudly in the small living room that I just sat there, holding a paired sock, completely speechless. That brutal truth crystallized perfectly during a rare, mandatory family dinner a few months later. We were seated around the heavy oak dining table at my parents' house in the suburbs. My mother had prepared a massive beef roast, and the air in the room was thick with a frenetic, celebratory energy. Wyatt had a brand new dream. He was going to open a high-end, boutique fitness studio called Forge 47 Athletics. He had glossy, expensive brochures, aggressive marketing buzzwords, and absolutely zero personal capital to back it up. My parents were practically vibrating with excitement. My father was loudly discussing limited liability corporations, target demographics, and profit margins as if Wyatt were the next great business mogul. My mother was already planning the catering menu for the grand opening party. They were openly talking about signing a massive commercial lease, buying tens of thousands of dollars in imported weightlifting equipment, and hiring a full staff of personal trainers. During a brief lull in the loud conversation, when my mother went to the kitchen to fetch the silver gravy boat, I cleared my throat. I looked directly at my father and casually mentioned that I had just been promoted to a senior specialist role at Granite Mutual. It came with a solid pay raise, a better title, and fully covered dental insurance. I was genuinely proud of it. It was the culmination of 3 years of flawless audits and gruelingly precise work. My father paused, his silver fork hovering halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, gave a brief, tight smile that did not reach his eyes, and said, "Yeah, stability is good. That is great, Monica." Then, without missing a single beat, he immediately turned his head back to Wyatt. "Now, about those liability waivers for the heavy lifting zones. Son, we need to make sure you are fully protected from lawsuits before the doors open." I sat there chewing a piece of dry roast beef, the sound of their enthusiastic business planning buzzing in my ears like thick static. I finally saw my exact position on the family chessboard, laid bare under the dining room chandelier. I was not just the forgotten daughter. I had morphed into the invisible contingency plan. I was the designated survivor. My parents implicitly trusted that I would always stay on the straight and narrow path, that I would always be perfectly reasonable, that I would never cause a dramatic scene, and most importantly, that I would never cost them a single dime. They could comfortably gamble their entire emotional and financial portfolio on Wyatt's chaotic, expensive whims because my ledger was perfectly, predictably balanced. I drove back to my apartment that night with Eli sitting quietly in the passenger seat. The amber streetlights flickered over the dark dashboard. I looked out the window and realized I had successfully built a life of rigid structure, quiet honor, and genuine love. I had a man beside me who saw my actual worth, and I had a stable career that protected me from the unpredictable, terrifying winds of poverty. I was safe. Yet, a dark, heavy intuition settled deep in my chest as I parked my reliable sedan in the gravel lot. I knew, with terrifying certainty, that my prized independence was completely untested by true disaster. If the ground ever crumbled beneath my feet, if I ever suffered a genuine financial slip and needed a hand to pull me up, I was going to find out exactly how little I meant to the people who shared my last name. The collapse did not happen in slow motion. It happened on a random Tuesday morning at 9:15. Granite Mutual Processing, the bedrock of my meticulously planned existence, was absorbed in a ruthless internal corporate buyout. An aggressive private equity firm out of Chicago swept through our floor like a scythe. My entire contract records control division was suddenly deemed a redundant operational expense. I was given a cardboard box, a severely reduced severance package that barely covered a week of groceries, and a security escort to the elevator. I stood on the concrete sidewalk outside the glass building, clutching my desk plant and my coffee mug, feeling the cold wind slice through my thin blazer. I was not just jobless. I was caught in a brutal timing squeeze. My apartment lease renewal was due on the 1st of the month. If I did not sign and pay the increased deposit, my landlord had a waiting list of college students ready to take my unit. Worse, my core professional compliance certificate, the single piece of paper that validated my entire career trajectory, was set to expire in exactly 14 days. If I let it lapse, the automated human resources algorithms at every major firm would instantly reject my resume. I would be knocked back to the bottom of the administrative pile. I went back to my apartment, sat at my tiny kitchen table, and did the brutal math. I tallied the rent, the non-negotiable certificate renewal fee, the baseline auto insurance to keep my car legal for interviews, and enough to avoid cascading late penalties. My emergency fund was completely depleted from a series of minor medical bills the previous winter. The exact shortfall was $3,800. It was not a fortune. It was a bridge. It was a perfectly calculated temporary lifeline to get me across a 90-day gap until a new payroll department processed my first check. I stared at my phone for 2 hours. I felt physically nauseous at the thought of breaking the absolute cardinal rule of my adulthood: never ask them for anything. But I had no other family, and Eli was drowning in his own student debt, living paycheck to paycheck on a guidance counselor salary. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and dialed my father. He answered on the 4th ring. "Douglas Fairchild speaking," he answered, his tone crisp and professional. I did not waste time with emotional pleasantries. I pitched him exactly like a vendor seeking a short-term corporate loan. I kept my voice perfectly level. I explained the buyout, the timing of the lease, and the urgency of the certificate. I laid out the exact number, $3,800. I promised, with absolute certainty, to repay every single cent within 90 days. I even offered to sign a formal promissory note with a standard interest rate. Through the receiver, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. The air in my apartment felt completely still. Then came the sigh. It was a distinct, rattling exhalation. I had heard that exact sigh 1,000 times throughout my childhood whenever I had inconvenienced him. "Monica," he started, his voice dripping with forced, paternal wisdom. "You know I love you, but you need to learn how to be independent. If I save you right now, you will never truly grow up. This is a character-building moment. A girl has to know how to take care of herself when things get tough. Bailing you out would be doing you a massive disservice." He was reading from his standard script, entirely blind to the burning building I was standing inside. He was treating a catastrophic career emergency like a missed homework assignment. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not remind him of the absolute hypocrisy of his words. The 17-year-old girl who desperately wanted him to see her was completely dead. The 34-year-old woman sitting at the kitchen table just felt a profound, freezing numbness spread through her veins. "I understand," I said softly. "You will figure it out," he replied cheerfully, eager to end the uncomfortable interaction. "You are the strong one." I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the table. 4 days later, my mother updated her social media feed. I was sitting in the dark, wearing a heavy sweater to save on the heating bill, endlessly refreshing job boards on my laptop. A notification popped up. Evelyn Fairchild had posted an album of 72 glossy, high-resolution photographs. The title of the album was Our Boy's Big Day. It was the grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony for Forge 47 Athletics. I clicked through the images, my eyes scanning the opulent details. There were towering racks of imported steel weights, rows of state-of-the-art cardiovascular machines with enormous digital screens, customized neon signage glowing against exposed brick walls, and an expensive catered spread of organic smoothies and protein bites. Wyatt was standing in the center of it all, grinning wildly, holding giant novelty scissors. My mother was beaming beside him. My father was clapping, looking at Wyatt with the exact look of absolute reverence he had never, not once, aimed in my direction. In the caption, my mother had written a gushing paragraph about taking massive leaps of faith for family. Then, my eyes caught a detail in one of the background photos. It was an accidental shot of my father shaking hands with a man wearing a local commercial real estate badge. I knew that badge. I knew the exact corporate plaza they had rented. I knew the baseline square footage costs in that district because I had audited lease agreements for a living. I did not need to guess the numbers. The cruel math assembled itself perfectly in my head. A commercial lease of that size, combined with the boutique equipment vendor contracts clearly visible in the photos, required massive collateral. Wyatt had no collateral. The only way that Jim existed was if my parents had co-signed the commercial lease and personally guaranteed the equipment financing. I did a quick, conservative calculation based on the square footage and the brand names stamped on the iron plates. It was over $118,000 in immediate, hard liability. The injustice was no longer a vague feeling from my childhood. It was quantified. It was printed in harsh, black and white ledgers. $118,000. That was the price tag for my brother's untested, chaotic vanity project. $3,800. That was the amount my father had just called an unacceptable crutch. $3,800 to keep my electricity running, to keep a roof over my head, and to save the career I had built from absolute scratch. They were willing to risk their retirement on his delusions, but they would not risk a fraction of that amount on my survival. A different kind of person might have taken screenshots, drafted a furious text message, and declared an explosive familial war. I did not. I realized that arguing with them was completely useless. You cannot negotiate with people who do not value your currency. They were entirely fueled by my predictability. They relied on the comforting assumption that Monica would always be there, absorbing the unfairness, keeping her head down, and never making a scene. I decided, in that freezing, dark apartment, to give them exactly what they had always demanded of me: complete, absolute independence. I did not send an angry email. I did not block their numbers in a fit of dramatic rage. I just stopped. I stopped initiating contact. I stopped liking my mother's photos. I stopped sending the obligatory holiday check-in texts. I stopped being the quiet, reliable anchor in the background of their chaotic lives. I let every single thread connecting me to the Fairchild family go completely slack. I vanished into thin air, leaving them with the golden sun they had purchased, while I prepared to claw my way out of the pit they had gladly let me fall into. The next 4 weeks were a masterclass in living right on a razor's edge. I did not have the luxury of sitting on my worn sofa and crying about my father's cruel lecture on self-reliance. Panic is a privilege for people who have a safety net to catch them when they faint. I only had concrete beneath me. I immediately went into a state of hyper-focused survival. I sold my best professional blazers and 2 pairs of good leather shoes to a high-end consignment shop across town for $140. I posted my television, my microwave, and my favorite reading chair on local internet marketplaces, haggling with strangers in grocery store parking lots to scrape together another $300. I swallowed every ounce of my pride, walked down to the leasing office, and negotiated a 14-day grace period with my skeptical property manager by showing him my impeccable 3-year payment history. To bridge the remaining gap, I signed up with 3 different bottom-tier temporary staffing agencies. I took whatever they threw at me. From 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, I sat in a freezing, poorly lit warehouse office, doing mindless numeric data entry for a regional logistics firm. During the days, I bounced between cramped dental offices and disorganized auto body shops, sorting through their neglected filing cabinets just to secure a handful of hourly wages. On the days when the sheer weight of the hustle became too heavy, when I could not bear to sit alone in my half-empty apartment staring at the mounting stack of utility bills, Eli would silently take my hand and lead me to his place. He lived in half of a drafty, cramped duplex near the community college. It smelled faintly of old roasted coffee and dusty library books, and the floorboards creaked violently with every step, but to me, it was a fortress. He never asked me to explain the humiliation of my father's rejection. He just made me cheap bowls of buttered noodles, wrapped me in a heavy wool blanket, and sat beside me on his ragged rug while I aggressively sent out resumes. The most profound shock of that entire month was not the financial terror. It was not the gnawing hunger or the physical exhaustion of working piecemeal jobs on 4 hours of sleep. The deepest, most agonizing wound was the profound, uninterrupted silence from my family. 21 days passed, 3 entire weeks. My phone did not ring a single time with a familiar caller identification. There were no casual text messages asking how my job hunt was going. There were no voicemails checking to see if I had made rent or if I was eating. Nobody asked if I was dead or alive. I would wake up in the middle of the night, look at the blank, dark screen of my phone, and realize the most devastating truth of my existence. My absence did not create a void in their lives. It created a convenience. By removing myself from the equation, I had absolved them of any lingering guilt. They could completely focus on Wyatt's shiny new fitness empire without the uncomfortable reminder of the daughter they had left to drown. The silence was finally broken on the 26th day, but not out of concern. My phone chimed with a text message from my mother. It did not ask how I was. It read, simply and transactionally, "Your father and I are taking our anniversary portrait at the church on Sunday at 10 in the morning. The pastor wants the whole family there. Wear the navy blue dress. Do not be late." I stared at the glowing letters for a long time. I was sitting at a wobbly folding table in a temporary office, eating a peanut butter sandwich that constituted my entire lunch. They did not care that I was financially suffocating. They just needed their perfectly quiet, obedient daughter to stand in the background of a photograph to maintain their flawless suburban facade. I typed a single word, "No." Her reply came back less than 2 minutes later, dripping with the defensive venom I knew so well. "You are overreacting. Stop punishing the family just because your father gave you some tough love. We expect you there." I turned the phone off and shoved it to the bottom of my purse. I did not reply. The very next morning, the temp agency dispatched me to a bleak, industrial business park on the edge of the city. The assignment was at a firm called North Vale Recovery Systems. They were a boutique, aggressive company that specialized in corporate loss recovery, contract risk assessment, and sniffing out massive financial liabilities for larger enterprises. My job was supposed to be simple: sit in a windowless records room and organize a massive, chaotic mountain of defaulted vendor files that had been neglected for 8 months. I sat down at a metal desk surrounded by towering cardboard boxes. Most temporary workers would have just alphabetized the folders, collected their minimum wage, and left at 5 in the afternoon. But my brain was wired for structure, and I was fueled by a cold, sharp need to exert control over something, anything, in my chaotic life. I did not just file the papers, I read them. By the end of my second day, I had cross-referenced a series of complicated indemnity clauses against a stack of hazy billing invoices. I found a distinct, repetitive pattern of fraudulent double billing hidden deep within a logistics contract. It was subtle, masked by clever legal jargon, but it was there. I gathered the specific documents, walked out of the records room, and asked the receptionist to point me toward whoever was in charge of the account. 5 minutes later, I was standing inside a sleek, glass-walled office, facing Maeve Donnelly. Maeve was the founder of North Vale. She was a fiercely intimidating woman in her late 50s, with sharp silver hair, a tailored charcoal suit, and eyes that looked like they could cut glass. She did not suffer fools, and she clearly did not expect a random temp worker to interrupt her afternoon. "Make it fast," Maeve said, not even looking up from her monitor. I placed the 3 specific folders directly in the center of her pristine desk. I did not stutter. I used the exact clinical tone I had perfected over years of being ignored. I explained the discrepancy, pointed out the buried clause, and showed her exactly how the vendor had illegally extracted over $42,000 from her client over the past 3 quarters. Maeve finally looked up. She stared at the highlighted numbers, then looked at me. The annoyance vanished from her face, replaced by a sharp, predatory calculation. She asked me 3 rapid-fire, highly technical questions about compliance codes. I answered all of them without blinking. "Who sent you here?" she asked, leaning back in her leather chair. "The downtown staffing agency," I replied. "I am just supposed to alphabetize the boxes." "Alphabetizing is for machines," Maeve said dryly. "You have the site. You can look at a pile of complete chaos and see the exact broken link in the chain. That is not something they teach in business school." The following Friday, Maeve called me back into her office. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an offer letter for a 90-day probationary position as a junior risk analyst. The starting salary was significantly higher than what I had been making at Granite Mutual. More importantly, it was a job that required teeth. It required looking for the lie, enforcing the rules, and never backing down from a discrepancy. I walked out of the building clutching the paper, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I drove straight to Eli's duplex. When he opened the door, I collapsed onto his sofa and burst into tears. It was not tears of joy. It was a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure exhaustion and imposter syndrome. I told him I could not do it. I told him I was just a tired, broke administrative assistant, that I was not aggressive enough for a place like North Vale, that I was bound to fail and end up right back at the bottom. The rejection from my father was still echoing loudly in my skull, telling me I was weak. Eli sat down beside me. He took the crumpled offer letter from my hand, smoothed it out on the coffee table, and looked at me with an intensity that anchored my spinning mind. "You do not owe your pain another lap," Eli said. His voice was steady and quiet. "Your family taught you to survive by making yourself small. But you are not small. Monica, you survived them. You survived this month. Take the job. Let the old version of you die here." I stared at the paper. I thought about the $118,000 my parents had eagerly risked on a son who never read a contract in his life. I thought about the church photograph they wanted me to smile in. The next morning, I signed the offer letter in steady, black ink. I accepted the job at North Vale Recovery Systems. And as I handed the paper back to Maeve Donnelly, I felt a quiet, permanent shift in my chest. I finally took a pair of scissors to the oldest, most pathetic hope I had carried since childhood. I stopped waiting for my family to suddenly wake up and realize they had wronged me. I realized they would never see my worth. And for the very first time in my life, I decided that I simply did not need them to. At North Vale Recovery Systems, I found my actual element. My entire life had been a rigorous training camp for emotional detachment and hypervigilance, and Maeve Donnelly's firm was the exact battlefield where those defensive traits transformed into lethal professional assets. I did not just pass my 90-day probationary period, I obliterated it. Within less than 12 months, I was promoted to the position of lead specialist in corporate loss recovery. My daily routine involved sitting across polished mahogany conference tables from furious, overpaid corporate attorneys and dismantling their faulty vendor agreements line by line. I brought a perfectly calibrated, freezing calm to every single negotiation. Because I had spent 3 decades navigating my father's psychological mazes, a bullying opposing counsel yelling about a breach of contract simply did not register on my emotional radar. During my 11th month, I developed and implemented a proprietary contract risk assessment protocol. It was a rigorous, multi-tiered auditing system designed to flag indemnification loopholes before corporate mergers were finalized. I tested it on a mid-sized healthcare acquisition, and my process successfully identified a hidden liability cascade that would have cost our client over $600,000. Maeve called me into her office the following afternoon, poured 2 glasses of expensive sparkling water, and slid a heavy ivory envelope across her desk. Inside was a performance bonus check that fundamentally altered my reality. It was more money in a single piece of paper than I had ever held in my entire life. I deposited it that afternoon, and for the very first time, I looked at a banking application and saw a fully funded, impenetrable emergency savings account bearing my own name. I was no longer a single misstep away from absolute financial ruin. The external victories were deeply satisfying, but the quiet, internal shifts were the ones that actually saved me. Eli did not propose with a flash mob or a hidden photographer at an expensive downtown restaurant. He knew my nervous system could not handle performative grand gestures. It happened on a random Thursday evening. We were standing in the cramped kitchen of his duplex, slicing fresh tomatoes for a simple pasta dinner. The radio was playing softly in the background. He set his knife down on the wooden cutting board, wiped his hands on a clean dish towel, and reached into his front pocket. He pulled out a modest, beautifully simple gold band. He looked at me, completely stripped of any pretense, and said the only words I ever needed to hear. "I know how hard you have fought to build your own walls. Monica, I will never ask you to tear them down. But I want to stand inside them with you. I promise you, right now, that I will never look at your strength and use it as an excuse to leave you to carry the heavy things alone." We got married exactly 4 months later on a rented, sun-drenched rooftop overlooking the city skyline. It was incredibly small and perfectly quiet. There were exactly 14 chairs. Maeve was there, wearing a sharp white suit. Eli's closest friends from his college years stood by his side. My only blood relative in attendance was my maternal cousin, Lena Hart, a sharp-witted woman who had always seen through my family's polished suburban veneer. My parents were not invited. Wyatt was not invited. I did not exclude them out of some fiery, vindictive need for revenge or dramatic flair. I simply realized that my wedding day was the first purely joyful milestone of my entire adulthood, and I absolutely refused to seek their permission or their approval to be happy. I did not want to spend my wedding reception watching my mother adjust my dress to look better for her social media photos. I did not want to listen to my father raise a glass and pivot his toast to Wyatt's latest fictional business prospect while I held a champagne flute. I wanted peace, and their complete absence was the necessary price of admission. Of course, in a sprawling Midwestern family network, secrets have an incredibly short shelf life. They found out about the wedding 3 weeks later through an overly talkative second aunt who saw a photograph Lena had casually posted online. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She was practically hysterical, weeping loudly through the receiver, lamenting the massive public embarrassment of a daughter getting married in secret. She wailed about how people at her weekend social club were asking questions she could not answer, completely centering her own social discomfort over the fact that her daughter had found lifelong love. I let her cry until she ran out of breath, offered a very calm, non-committal apology for her hurt pride, and ended the call. My father did not call. He did not ask to meet Eli for a firm handshake to welcome him to the family. He did not ask where we went for our honeymoon. He sent exactly one text message, completely devoid of punctuation or human warmth. It read, "Heard you got married. Congratulations." It was a masterpiece of cold, detached avoidance. There was no further inquiry, no acknowledgement of the 18 months of absolute silence, and zero apologies for letting me nearly drown when I lost my job. It was a transaction of minimal social obligation, sent only so he could tell himself he had done the right thing. After the wedding, my mother slowly started attempting to weave me back into the familial fabric, but only when it directly served her specific needs. As the winter holidays approached, she would send brief, anxious text messages demanding my presence at large family gatherings. Her invitations were never framed around a genuine desire to see me or to get to know my new husband. Instead, she would write things like, "Please come to the Christmas Eve dinner. Monica, people are starting to talk, and we just want you to act normal." Do not make the family atmosphere awkward this year. I had transitioned from the invisible daughter to a necessary physical prop. I was just a warm body, required in the dining room to maintain the fragile illusion of an unbroken, loving family unit. I agreed to attend exactly one event, the funeral of my great-uncle in late February. I walked into the crowded, flower-scented funeral home with Eli holding my hand tightly. I looked around the large viewing room filled with aunts, uncles, and cousins I had known my entire life, and I realized with a startling clarity that I felt like a complete stranger. I was a polite guest standing in the middle of my own bloodline. Wyatt was standing near the expensive wooden casket, wearing a poorly fitted black suit that my parents had undoubtedly purchased for him. He was holding court with a group of distant relatives, loudly exaggerating the temporary hurdles of running his boutique gym, painting himself as a struggling titan of industry. When I walked up to pay my respects, he stopped talking mid-sentence. He gave me a quick, calculating look from head to toe. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not congratulate me on my recent marriage. He simply locked eyes with me and said, "Monica, tell Uncle David about how crazy commercial zoning laws are right now. You deal with that corporate stuff. Back me up here." Even standing feet away from a casket, I only existed to him as a validation tool. I was just a minor supporting character summoned to the stage to make his chaotic story sound more credible to an audience. I offered a polite, vague nod to the relatives, turned on my heel, and walked away with my husband. As we drove back to our quiet, peaceful apartment that evening, I watched the city streetlights blur through the passenger window. I felt an immense, grounding weight settle deep into my bones. The frantic, desperate energy of my 20s was completely gone. I was highly respected in a cutthroat corporate industry. I had a husband who valued my mind and fiercely protected my peace. I had a bank account that ensured I would never have to beg a man like Douglas Fairchild for my own survival ever again. For the very first time in my entire existence, I was no longer just treading water. I was no longer just surviving the Fairchild family mechanics. I was genuinely thriving. I had built a magnificent, sturdy ship out of the wreckage they had left me in. And it was exactly that undeniable strength, that hard-won stability, that would make the incoming phone call, the one that would arrive on a completely ordinary Wednesday afternoon, infinitely more bitter than anything I had ever tasted before. It was a completely ordinary Wednesday afternoon at Northvale Recovery Systems. I was sitting at my sleek desk, nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee, aggressively redlining a massive, deeply flawed corporate debt recovery file. My office was a quiet sanctuary of structured logic, filled with the comforting rustle of thick paper and the sharp scent of dry erase markers. I was in the absolute center of my element, completely insulated by the cold, predictable rules of commercial contract law. Then, my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished glass of my desk. I shifted my gaze to the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed two words I had practically excised from my daily vocabulary: Douglas Fairchild. It had been nearly 18 months of profound, echoing silence since he stood on his moral high ground and told me that letting me face eviction and career ruin was simply a character-building exercise. I let the phone ring 3 distinct times. A strange, absolute stillness settled deep in my chest. I did not feel the familiar childhood panic. I did not feel the desperate urge to please. I simply picked up the device, pressed it to my ear, and waited. "Monica," he said. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I was healthy, or if my new marriage to Eli was going well. The booming, falsely authoritative voice that had dominated the dining room table of my entire youth was completely gone. In its place was a thin, ragged, and undeniably desperate rasp. He went straight into the absolute center of the disaster without a single prelude. "I need your help. We have a massive situation here." I did not offer a warm greeting. I did not gasp in shock. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, picked up my heavy silver pen, and said, "Go ahead." He exhaled sharply, and over the next 10 minutes, the pristine, expensive, carefully curated facade of the Fairchild family completely shattered right into my ear. 7. Athletics was not just experiencing a temporary dip in revenue, it had completely collapsed several months ago. It was a smoking, catastrophic financial crater. The details spilled out of my father in a frantic, disjointed rush that sounded incredibly foreign coming from a man who always prided himself on absolute control. Wyatt had actively driven the business straight into a concrete wall. He had hidden massive, compounding debts from everyone. He had stopped paying his core staff of personal trainers their hourly wages. He had completely ignored the aggressive monthly invoices for the imported heavy lifting equipment and the digital treadmills. Most dangerously, he had failed to remit the state and federal payroll taxes, an offense that carried severe, immediate penalties. Because my father and my mother had proudly and foolishly signed their names as personal guarantors on every single piece of paper Wyatt shoved in front of them, the fallout was dropping directly onto their heads. The commercial landlord had already filed a formal lawsuit in the county court for breach of lease. The equipment leasing company had submitted an aggressive motion for a summary judgment to immediately seize the remaining assets and garnish wages. And quietly, behind the scenes, their local bank was actively tightening the home equity line of credit because my parents had secretly, desperately borrowed against the equity of their own house to keep Wyatt's sinking ship afloat. I sat perfectly still, listening to the frantic unraveling of the Golden Boy's empire. "We need cash, Monica," my father finally admitted, his voice cracking with an ugly, entirely unfamiliar humiliation. "We need $26,000 by Friday afternoon, just to halt the immediate court filings and prevent a total cascade of legal defaults. If the judgments hit the public record, the bank will call the entire mortgage due. We will lose the house." But he did not just need a blank check. He needed a human shield. "You understand these complicated contracts," he pleaded, his tone shifting from panic into a desperate, familiar manipulation. "You look at this corporate stuff every single day for a living. You can talk to these lawyers. You were always the one who could handle things." He said it so casually, so automatically, completely blind to the agonizing irony of his own desperate words. "You were always the one who could handle things." He did not view me as a beloved daughter in a time of terrifying crisis. He did not view me as a person he had deeply wronged and abandoned. He simply viewed me as a highly reliable, heavily trained tool that he had kept locked in the shed for emergencies. When the engine of his life caught fire, he finally remembered exactly where he put the fire extinguisher. I did not scream at him. I did not laugh maliciously into the receiver. I kept my voice as flat and smooth as polished stone. I told him to scan and email me every single legal document, every demand letter, and every lease agreement. Then, I hung up the phone. I did not immediately agree to pay. I only agreed to read. My next action was not to call my bank to check my balances, but to call my cousin, Lena Hart. If my father was telling me the house was on fire, Lena was the person who would tell me exactly who poured the gasoline and struck the match. I reached her while she was on her lunch break, and within 15 minutes, the entire, rotting underbelly of the situation was brutally exposed. It was infinitely worse than a simple, tragic failed business venture. Wyatt had not just struggled with competitive marketing or client retention. According to Lena, who had heard the unfiltered truth directly from her mother, Wyatt had been aggressively burning the operational capital on illegal offshore sports betting. When he was not gambling away the employee payroll, he was siphoning massive amounts of cash to fund an extravagant, entirely fraudulent lifestyle to maintain his image as a highly successful entrepreneur on social media. He bought expensive tailored suits, leased a luxury sports car he could not afford, and bought premium tables at downtown nightclubs, all while the gym's basic utility bills went unpaid. The most sickening, unforgivable part of the entire revelation was that my parents had known about the reckless, illegal bleeding for months. They had actively covered it up out of sheer, suffocating shame. They had continued to write personal checks from their dwindling retirement accounts to hide his spectacular implosion from the extended family. protecting his ego right up until the very moment the lawsuits arrived at their front door. The entire Fairchild network, the sprawling web of aunts, uncles, and cousins, already knew that Wyatt was a bottomless, toxic financial pit. Nobody was offering them a single dime of sympathy, let alone a loan. I was the absolute last resort. I was the only person left on the entire board who possessed the liquid capital, the specialized legal intellect, and the deeply ingrained, lifelong psychological conditioning of being forced to step up and fix the mess. They were banking entirely on my childhood trauma. They were betting their suburban house on the assumption that my desperate, pathetic need to finally earn my father's approval would override my basic financial common sense. I sat alone in my quiet office as the late afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across my desk. The silence in the room was deafening. The ethical and emotional math was agonizingly clear, forming a brilliant, terrible dilemma in my mind. I could simply delete the incoming emails, turn my phone off, and walk away. I would be completely, unequivocally justified in my refusal. I could watch the bank take their pristine house and let Wyatt face the brutal, unfiltered consequences of his own disastrous actions. No judge, no therapist, and no reasonable human being on earth would ever blame me for letting them drown in the exact same cold waters they had so easily tossed me into 18 months ago. But the alternative was equally terrifying. If I simply transferred the $26,000, if I blindly stepped in and used my professional skills to negotiate the settlements just to make their pain go away, I would not be saving my family. I would be actively, willingly reviving the exact same abusive system that had crushed my spirit for 3 decades. I would be confirming their darkest belief, that Monica exists only to serve, that Monica requires no maintenance, and that Monica will always pay the bill for Wyatt's sins. I had reached my absolute breaking point, fully aware that rescuing them on their terms would guarantee my own ruin all over again. I left my father's call unanswered that night. I did not call him the next morning, either. For the first time in my entire existence, I did not let the deeply ingrained, desperate panic of my childhood dictate my response time. I was no longer the obedient daughter scrambling to fix a broken vase before anyone noticed. I was a senior risk analyst, and I was holding all the cards in a very high-stakes negotiation. Before I offered a single word of reply, I needed to gather my counsel. I needed to consult the 3 people who represented the distinct pillars of my new life: protection, historical context, and absolute, unflinching reality. That night, in the quiet safety of our living room, I laid the entire situation out for Eli. I told him about the $26,000 they needed immediately, the secret home equity loans, and the staggering depth of Wyatt's financial ruin. Eli sat on the sofa, listening with that characteristic, steady calm. He did not tell me to abandon them, nor did he encourage me to save them. He simply placed his hand over mine, representing the absolute safety I had never felt growing up. "I will support whatever decision helps you sleep at night," Eli said softly. "But remember that you are not the same woman they threw out into the cold. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep their illusion warm." The next morning, I called my cousin Lena. If Eli provided the emotional armor, Lena provided the necessary intelligence on the ground. She understood the toxic root system of the Fairchild family tree better than anyone else. I needed to know if there was any genuine remorse echoing in the halls of my extended family. Lena laughed a bitter, hollow laugh through the phone. She confirmed that my parents were still completely trapped in their own delusions, quietly blaming the economy and bad business partners for Wyatt's catastrophic failure, rather than admitting their golden boy was a reckless liability. Talking to Lena fortified my resolve. It reminded me that giving them grace would only be met with more manipulation. But the final, defining piece of advice came from Maeve Donnelly. I walked into her sleek office during my lunch break, closed the glass door, and gave her a brief, sterilized overview of my family's impending bankruptcy. I asked her how she would structure a corporate bailout for a highly toxic subsidiary. Maeve leaned back in her leather chair, steepled her fingers, and looked at me with those piercing, glass-cutting eyes. She did not offer sympathy, She offered strategy. "You have a choice right now. Monica," Maeve said, her voice sharp and steady. "You can write a check, wipe your hands, and walk away. That is the easy route. But from what you have told me about these people, they will just build another house of cards and expect you to catch it when it falls. Helping without changing the rules of the game is just enabling the old loop." That single sentence was the catalyst for everything that followed. I realized that if I was going to deploy my capital to save their suburban kingdom, I was going to completely rewrite the constitution of our family. I did not call my parents. Instead, I called Nora Bell. Nora was a brilliant, aggressive estate and contract attorney I had frequently collaborated with on complex corporate recovery cases. I hired her on retainer that very afternoon. I sat in her pristine downtown office and spent 3 hours meticulously drafting a comprehensive, bulletproof legal package. I explicitly told Nora that I would not transfer a single dollar based on blind trust. I would not save them out of lingering, pathetic pity. And I absolutely refused to accept the classic Fairchild method of handling conflict, which was to vaguely promise that we would all figure it out later. I constructed a series of ironclad conditions. First, my parents were required to surrender total financial transparency. They had to provide every single debt record, every bank statement, every signed personal guarantee, the paperwork for the secondary mortgage they had secretly taken out, and every hidden receipt related to Wyatt's business. If they concealed even a single dollar of liability, the deal was instantly void. Second, the rescue funds would never touch my parents' bank accounts, and Wyatt would not have access to a single cent. The $26,000 would be placed directly into an escrow account managed by Nora. The money would only be dispersed directly to the commercial landlord and the equipment leasing firm as part of a formal, legally binding settlement negotiation. Furthermore, the money was not a gift to give the boy another chance. It was a strict loan, bound by a legally registered promissory note with a fixed repayment schedule. The third condition was the absolute heaviest, the one designed to permanently destroy the foundational lie of my entire childhood. I required my parents to sit down with Nora and legally amend the Fairchild Family Trust. We were going to formally document every single dollar they had pumped into Wyatt over the past decade, the ruined cars, the paid-off credit cards, the failed gym, the bailed-out leases, and legally classify that massive sum as an early advancement on his inheritance. I was going to ensure that when the time eventually came to read a will, no one could ever stand in a lawyer's office and pretend that everything had been divided equally. The invisible favoritism was going to be quantified, printed in bold ink, and notarized. Finally, I demanded a mandatory face-to-face meeting at the old house. I refused to negotiate these terms over the phone. I needed them to look me in the eye. I added a strict communication clause to this meeting. They were not allowed to deflect to general, weeping emotions. They were not allowed to blame a misunderstanding. They were expressly forbidden from calling this a difficult phase. I wanted them to use precise, accurate language to name exactly what they had done to their son, and exactly what they had done to their daughter. It was exactly 48 hours after his initial, desperate plea when I finally called my father back. He answered on the very first ring, his breathing heavy and anxious. "Monica, did you get the money together? The lawyers are calling the house." I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth or childhood fear. "I have the funds, Douglas, and I have a solution that will stop the judgments and save the house. But it comes with a structural agreement. You are going to listen to me very carefully." I read the terms to him. I outlined the escrow, the promissory note, the mandatory financial disclosures, the trust amendment, and the face-to-face meeting. I spoke in the exact clinical tone I used to dismantle fraudulent vendors in corporate boardrooms. For a long moment, there was a stunned, vibrating silence on the line. Then the predictable, explosive outrage arrived. My father's voice boomed through the receiver, reverting to his old dominant posturing. He was furious. He was deeply insulted that his daughter, the girl who was always supposed to quietly endure, was suddenly dictating the rules of engagement. He accused me of being cold, of treating family like a sterile business transaction, of kicking them while they were down. He yelled that a daughter does not demand collateral from her own flesh and blood. I did not interrupt him. I let him burn through his anger, recognizing it for what it truly was, the terrifying realization that he had completely lost his power over me. When he finally ran out of breath, I heard a shuffling sound in the background. My mother's voice, trembling and thin with pure desperation, cut through the line. "Douglas, stop," she pleaded, crying openly. "Stop it. The bank called again this morning. We do not have another way. We have nothing else." My father breathed heavily into the phone. The fight slowly drained out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of his own financial reality. He was a proud man who had built his entire identity on being the capable patriarch, but the numbers do not care about a man's pride. He had run out of runway, and he knew it. "Fine," he whispered, the words sounding like ash in his mouth. "We will agree to the terms. When do you want to meet?" "Tomorrow night, at 8 o'clock, I replied smoothly. "Have the paperwork ready on the dining room table." I hung up the phone, feeling a strange, profound calm settle over my shoulders. The girl who used to beg for their attention was entirely gone. In her place was a woman who was about to walk into her childhood home, not to ask for a seat at the table, but to completely own the room. I drove up the familiar concrete driveway right at 8 o'clock in the evening. The massive oak trees lining the street looked exactly the same as they did when I was a teenager. The white shutters were still perfectly painted. Walking through the heavy oak front door, the scent of cinnamon and old wood hit me. A sensory ghost immediately trying to pull me back into the role of the quiet, accommodating child. I stepped into the formal dining room. The space felt entirely alien. I realized with a sharp pang that my sense of belonging had completely evaporated. I was standing inside the architecture of my childhood, but I was nothing more than a visiting creditor. The pristine familiarity of the room only made the impending conversation feel sharper. My parents were sitting at the long mahogany table. Manila folders, thick stacks of bank statements, and legal contracts were scattered across the polished wood. My father looked severely aged, the rigid, imposing posture of his corporate years finally collapsing under the crushing weight of his son's debt. My mother had her hands tightly folded in her lap, her eyes already red-rimmed and fearful. I sat down directly across from them. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not ask how their week was going. I pulled my own notepad from my leather briefcase and set my pen down. "Before we look at these numbers," I said, my voice perfectly level and quiet, "I am going to tell you exactly where I have been for the last 18 months. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I laid out the stark, brutal facts of my survival with the precision of an auditor. I told them about the corporate buyout that instantly severed my income. I described the freezing night sitting on a second-hand rug, surrounded by final utility notices, doing mindless data entry for minimum wage until 2 in the morning just to afford basic groceries. I told them about swallowing my pride and selling my professional clothes to consignment shops. I explained the terrifying reality of almost losing my compliance license, the single piece of paper that kept me from falling into total poverty. I recounted moving my few remaining boxes into Eli's cramped duplex because I could not afford to keep my own roof over my head. Then, I looked directly into my father's eyes. "And I told you about the day I called you," I said. "I asked you for a short-term bridge loan of $3,800. You told me that if you saved me, I would never truly grow up. You told me I needed to learn how to be independent. You taught me a lesson about maturity while I was actively drowning." My father shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. The defensive walls he had built over 30 years instantly went up. He used the exact same tired justifications he had always leaned on, the ones perfectly designed to mask his neglect as a twisted form of parental pride. "You have to understand my position. Monica," he said, his voice carrying a desperate, pleading edge. "You always seemed completely fine. You were always the tough one. You never complained. Wyatt breaks so easily. He is fragile. He needs constant guidance. You have this incredible armor. You are durable. I knew you would find a way to land on your feet because you always do." He actually believed his own narrative. He genuinely believed my durability was a valid, logical excuse to abandon me. I let a heavy, suffocating silence fill the dining room. I looked at both of them, feeling the very last remaining threads of my childhood illusions snap completely. "Me being strong," I said, every single word hitting the air like a heavy stone, "does not mean I needed to be loved any less." The room went completely dead. My father stopped talking. The air felt vacuumed out of the space. My mother suddenly broke. A ragged, ugly sob tore out of her throat. She pressed her hands over her face, the polished suburban matriarch completely dissolving in front of me. She confessed the quiet truth they had buried for decades. "We just assumed," she cried, her voice shaking violently. "We always just assumed you would figure it out. You were so smart. You never asked for anything. Wyatt took everything we had, every ounce of energy and every spare dollar. We just got used to your sacrifices being free. We took your independence for granted because it was the only way we could survive him." I stared at her. They had treated my competence as a permanent discount on their parental obligations. "We are documenting everything tonight," I said, tapping the thick manila folders on the table. "Every bailout, every hidden loan, it all goes into the trust amendment as an early inheritance for Wyatt. I require complete disclosure. If my lawyer finds a single dollar missing from this ledger tomorrow morning, I am walking out that door and the bank takes this house." My father looked down at his hands. His knuckles were white. He swallowed hard, a visible tremor running through his jaw. "There is something else," he whispered. The booming authority was entirely gone. He sounded like a terrified, broken old man. I did not move. "Tell me." He could barely look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the grain of the mahogany table. "When your grandmother Ruth passed away, she did not just leave you her jewelry. She left a certificate of deposit. It was for $12,000. She specifically put your name on the memo line. She wrote that it was for your continuing education or for the down payment on your first house." My heart slammed against my ribs. I kept my face entirely blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my shock. "Where is it?" My father closed his eyes. Tears leaked out from the corners. Wyatt had just defaulted on the massive inventory loan for his online supplement business. The creditors were threatening to sue him for fraud because he lied on the financial applications. I was the executor of Ruth's estate. I cashed the certificate. I paid off Wyatt's debt to keep him out of court. I told myself I would pay you back when things stabilized, but things never stabilized. The breath physically left my lungs. This was not just emotional bias anymore. This was not a passive failure to protect me or a simple lack of attention. This was an active, deliberate theft. My father had reached directly into my future, stolen the only piece of true financial security anyone in this family had ever tried to give me, and set it on fire to keep his golden sun warm. He had done it all under the sickening, self-righteous banner of family helping family. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up. I was done. There was no legal contract in the world that could regulate this level of profound betrayal. I reached for my purse on the table, fully prepared to let the bank seize every brick of this house. "Monica, please," my father begged, his voice finally cracking into a high, desperate pitch. He stood up, his hands shaking as he reached toward me. The stoic shell shattered completely. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly. "Why?" I demanded, the question tearing out of me sharper and louder than I intended. "Why did his failures mean more to you than my future?" He looked up, his face wet and completely stripped of his lifelong pride. He finally confessed the darkest, most pathetic secret of his entire existence. "Because he needed me," he sobbed. "Wyatt failing made me feel powerful. It made me feel like I was the only man who could save him. I was the patriarch. But you? You never needed me. You built your own life. You fixed your own problems. It bruised my ego. I resented how little you needed my help, so I convinced myself you could just take the hits. I sacrificed you because you were strong enough to survive it, and I knew he was not. I stood in the dining room of my childhood, looking at the weeping man who had taught me everything I knew about surviving alone. The hot anger suddenly vanished, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I did not feel pity. I did not feel rage. I just saw the transaction for exactly what it was. The morning after the catastrophic dining room confession, I did not wake up feeling a sense of emotional closure. I woke up feeling like a forensic accountant who had just been handed a crime scene. I gathered the massive, disorganized stack of manila folders my parents had provided and drove straight to Nora Bell's downtown office. I dropped the heavy pile of financial history directly onto her glass desk. I instructed her to verify absolutely every single line item. Nora was a predator in the world of contract law, and it took her exactly 4 hours to find the rotting floorboard my parents had desperately tried to conceal. It was not a small oversight. Buried deep within a stack of seemingly mundane banking statements, Nora uncovered a secondary home equity line of credit. They had quietly borrowed an additional $45,000 against the house 6 months prior to the gym's collapse, a completely undisclosed loan used entirely to float Wyatt's personal living expenses when his business accounts first ran dry. They had deliberately omitted it from the disclosure package, clinging to the pathetic, lingering habit of hiding the ugliest parts of Wyatt's reality from me. A younger version of myself would have burst into tears, driven back to the suburbs, and screamed until my throat bled about the constant, suffocating betrayal. The woman sitting in Nora Bell's office did not even blink. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my father's number. Nora found the secondary equity line. I said the absolute second he answered the phone. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. The tone was pure, freezing liquid nitrogen. You lied again. You tried to protect his image on my dime. Monica, please, I just forgot to include that specific folder, he stammered, the panic instantly flooding back into his voice. It was an oversight in the rush of gathering the papers. I do not do business with liars, I replied, cutting him off completely. You have exactly 60 minutes to send a comprehensive, notarized list of any other hidden debts to Nora. If another discrepancy is found, if there is a single outstanding credit card or unrecorded personal loan missing from this ledger at the end of the hour, I will permanently close the escrow account. I will walk away, and the bank will put a foreclosure notice on your front door by Friday morning. Do you understand me? Yes, he whispered, utterly defeated. Yes, I understand. He sent the remaining documents over within 20 minutes. Once the full, unfiltered scope of the financial wreckage was laid out on the table, I went to work. I did not just blindly write a check to cover the initial panic number. That was how my father operated, throwing money into a black hole just to make the immediate discomfort disappear. Instead, I applied the exact same ruthless surgical tactics I used every single day at Northvale Recovery Systems. I personally contacted the commercial landlord and the legal representatives for the boutique fitness equipment leasing firm. I bypassed my parents' incompetent local attorney entirely. I sat in a high-rise conference room and systematically dismantled their leverage. I pointed out the structural flaws in their original lease agreements. I highlighted the rapid depreciation value of used, heavy iron weights and sweaty treadmills, proving that seizing the equipment would cost them more in legal and auction fees than they could ever hope to recover. I made it agonizingly clear that my parents were completely insolvent and that pushing for a summary judgment would force them into Chapter 7 bankruptcy, leaving the creditors with absolutely 0 cents on the dollar. I offered them a single, non-negotiable lump sum settlement. It was a take-it-or-leave-it offer, backed by immediate wire transfers from my escrow account. Faced with the reality of receiving guaranteed cash versus fighting a losing battle in bankruptcy court, both parties folded. I managed to crush the massive debt load down to a fraction of its original size. I did not save my parents with soft-hearted pity. I saved them with brutal, undeniable corporate competence. Only after every single settlement number was permanently locked in writing did I authorize the release of the funds. The official signing took place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Nora Bell's boardroom. My parents sat silently across the wide table. There were no tears this time. There was only the heavy, suffocating realization of their new reality. They signed the binding promissory note, committing to a strict monthly repayment schedule for the exact amount of the settlement funds I provided. They signed a separate, legally binding pledge stating they would never again act as financial guarantors for Wyatt, nor would they ever attempt to use my name, my credit, or my assets for any future financial decisions. But the absolute heaviest blow, the masterpiece of the entire legal package, was the formal amendment to the Fairchild Family Trust. Nora handed my parents a thick, heavily tabulated document. It was a comprehensive, legally binding ledger of every single dollar they had pumped into Wyatt over the past 10 years. It included the massive capital injection for the failed studio, the endless stream of bailed-out credit cards, the legal fees from his used car brokerage disaster, and the $12,000 stolen from my grandmother Ruth's certificate of deposit. By signing this document, Nora explained, her voice echoing coldly in the quiet room, you are legally classifying this aggregate sum as an advancement on Wyatt Fairchild's future inheritance. This legally guarantees that upon the execution of your estate, his portion will be reduced by this exact dollar amount to ensure equitable distribution. It was a completely legal, absolutely devastating strike against the Golden Boy. They were forced to sign their names to a document that permanently revoked his invisible, unlimited access to their wealth. The invisible favoritism was now dead, replaced by cold, hard accounting. 2 days after the ink dried and the lawsuits were officially dropped, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Wyatt's name. I answered it while sitting at my desk at North Vale, putting him on speakerphone while I continued to review a vendor contract. Hey, sis, Wyatt said. His voice was dripping with a thick, artificial warmth, a sickeningly casual intimacy that completely ignored the smoking crater of his life. Mom said you really stepped up and helped sort out the messy gym paperwork. You are a lifesaver. Monica, I knew you had my back. He paused, clearly waiting for me to play my old role, to offer a comforting word or minimize the damage. I let a long, heavy silence stretch across the line. Look, he continued, his tone shifting quickly to his standard, aggressive sales pitch. The brick-and-mortar gym model is dead anyway. It was a bad market. But I have this incredible new vision. Mobile, high-end personal training. I bring the workout directly to corporate executives. I just need a small seed investment to get the branding off the ground. $10,000 would cover the marketing and the legal fees to set up the new corporation. You clearly have the connections now. He was asking the sister he had actively stolen from to fund his next delusion, completely convinced that because I had fixed the parents' mess, the Bank of Monica was now fully open for his personal withdrawals. I stopped reading my contract. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. I did not scream at him. I did not launch into a furious tirade about Grandma Ruth's stolen money or the sheer, blinding audacity of his request. I reached back into the darkest corner of my own history, picked up the exact weapon my father had used to dismiss my survival, and handed it directly to my brother. Wyatt, I said, my voice projecting a terrifying, absolute calm. You need to learn how to be independent. If I save you right now, you will never truly grow up. Bailing you out would be doing you a massive disservice. The silence on the other end of the line was violently thick. He stammered, completely unable to process the familiar words coming out of my mouth. Are you serious right now? I am talking about a real business opportunity. You are just going to hang me out to dry? You have to know how to take care of yourself when things get tough, I added smoothly, quoting our father verbatim. I am done here. Do not call this number again. I disconnected the call. The sheer, absolute peace that washed over me was intoxicating. Of course, Wyatt did not possess the emotional maturity to accept defeat quietly. Within 48 hours, he was aggressively working the phones, calling every aunt, uncle, and distant cousin in the Fairchild directory. He spun a wild, victimized narrative. He told everyone who would listen that I was a ruthless, vindictive tyrant who was using my new corporate salary to hold our elderly parents hostage. He claimed I was forcing them to sign away their rights and punishing the family for a few simple business mistakes. My cousin Helena called me, warning me that the family gossip mill was running at maximum capacity. She asked if I wanted to release a statement or defend myself against his slander. I told Helena no. I did not engage. I did not post a single defensive message online or call a single relative to plead my case. I remained completely silent, letting Wyatt scream his lies into the void. I did not need to win a shouting match in the court of public opinion, because I knew the final battle was rapidly approaching. And this time, unlike my childhood, the absolute truth was not just a feeling. It was meticulously bound, signed, notarized, and sitting securely in my lawyer's heavy iron safe, waiting for the perfect moment to be unleashed. The final execution of the trust amendment and the settlement distribution took place on a completely clear Friday morning at 10 o'clock. Nora Bell's downtown conference room was practically freezing, smelling faintly of lemon polish, fresh coffee, and expensive leather. I sat on one side of the massive, dark oak table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting over a thick leather portfolio. My parents sat directly across from me. They looked profoundly exhausted, carrying the distinct, hollowed-out appearance of people who had finally stopped running from a devastating reality. Nora was systematically organizing the heavy stacks of bond paper, placing gold-barreled pens next to the signature lines. The atmosphere was incredibly dense, heavy with the quiet solemnity of a total structural surrender. Then, the heavy frosted glass door swung open without a single knock. Wyatt walked into the room. He was wearing a fitted designer leather jacket and a perfectly pressed shirt, projecting the breezy, arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed the entire universe was simply a catering service designed to accommodate his needs. He actually had a completely relaxed, confident smile plastered across his face. I instantly shifted my gaze to my mother. She flinched, her eyes dropping immediately to her lap. In a desperate, delusional attempt to manifest a cinematic family reconciliation, she had secretly texted him the time and location of the meeting. She had genuinely hoped that if we were all just sitting in the same room together, the harsh legal boundaries would suddenly melt away, and we could go back to being a cohesive unit that simply brushed his catastrophic failures under the rug. "Hey, everyone," Wyatt announced, pulling out a heavy leather chair at the head of the table and dropping himself into it. "Mom told me we were finalizing the gym paperwork today. I just wanted to come down and say thanks for getting the landlords off my back. Monica, I knew we could sit down and get things back to normal." He thought the storm had completely passed. He genuinely believed that because I had injected capital into the situation, the board was miraculously reset to zero. In his mind, my parents were still his ultimate safety net, and he was still the undisputed center of the family's financial solar system. Nora Bell did not even look up from her paperwork. She did not offer him a greeting, nor did she offer him a pen. She simply picked up a heavily tabulated, officially stamped document and slid a copy across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of Wyatt. "We are not here to normalize anything, Mr. Fairchild," Nora stated, her voice carrying the cold, mechanical authority of a judge reading a verdict. "We are here to formally restructure this family's estate. The document in front of you is a legally binding ledger. It details every single dollar your parents have liquidated, borrowed, or redirected to cover your personal and business liabilities over the past decade. The total aggregate sum is $385,000. Wyatt stared at the thick black numbers printed on the crisp white paper. The confident smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, defensive confusion. Nora continued, completely unbothered by his shock. "Your parents are signing an irrevocable amendment to the Fairchild Family Trust today. This document legally classifies that entire sum as an early to finalized advancement on your inheritance. Your portion of any future estate distribution is completely exhausted, You are entitled to absolutely nothing moving forward." Wyatt let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He pushed the paper back across the table as if it were infected. He immediately reverted to the only strategy he had ever known. He turned directly to our father to demand an aggressive defense. "Dad, tell her to put this garbage away," Wyatt demanded, his voice rising in panic and anger. "This is insane. You cannot let Monica's lawyer sit here and write me out of the family. Tell her to stop this right now." I watched my father very closely. For my entire 34 years on this earth, this was the exact moment where Douglas Fairchild would undoubtedly step in, raise his booming voice, bend the rules of reality, and shield his fragile son from the brutal consequences of the real world. But my father did not raise his voice. He did not move to comfort Wyatt. He sat perfectly still, his shoulders slumped, staring at the empty space on the table. When he finally turned his head to look at his son, his eyes were completely dead. "I am not stopping anything, Wyatt," my father said. His voice was terrifyingly quiet and completely stripped of its lifelong pride. "The papers are accurate. We are signing them today." Wyatt's jaw physically dropped. "Are you out of your mind? She is trying to ruin me." "You ruined yourself," my father replied, the words dropping like heavy lead weights onto the table. It was the greatest, most profound axis shift I had ever witnessed in my life. The patriarch was finally laying down his sword. "Monica is absolutely right. I spent my entire life blindly rewarding the wrong child. I protected you from every single consequence, and it nearly cost us our home. I cannot save you anymore. I will not save you anymore." Before Wyatt could even process the absolute destruction of his primary safety net, Nora Bell dropped the final devastating legal hammer. "Furthermore," Nora announced, her tone clipping through the tense air, "your parents executed an additional transfer at 8 o'clock this morning. The family lake house property has been formally moved into a restrictive, irrevocable trust structure. It is now managed by an independent corporate co-trustee. This means your parents no longer possess the unilateral legal authority to mortgage, sell, or leverage that property." I watched the realization hit Wyatt like a physical blow to the chest. The lake house was the crown jewel of the Fairchild assets. It was his ultimate, unspoken backup plan, the final piece of massive collateral he had undoubtedly planned to manipulate out of them for his next inevitable business scheme. I had purposefully locked it inside a legal vault where his emotional manipulation could never, ever reach it. Wyatt completely lost control. He shot up from his chair, his face flushed dark red with pure, unfiltered rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, trying desperately to turn me into the ultimate villain of the room. "You are sick," he spat, his voice echoing loudly against the glass walls. "You are a cold, calculating sociopath. You are just sitting here settling personal scores with your own blood because you were always jealous. You planned this whole thing just to humiliate me in front of them." I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not offer a passionate defense of my character, and I did not list the decades of silent neglect I had endured. I simply looked up at him, meeting his furious, terrified eyes with a gaze of absolute, impenetrable calm. "You were raised to always have someone catch you," I said, locking the entire traumatic history of our family into a single, undeniable truth. "I was taught to stand on my own 2 feet. Today, you try doing that." Wyatt stood there for 3 long, agonizing seconds, his chest heaving, desperately waiting for someone to flinch. He waited for my mother to burst into tears and beg for peace. He waited for my father to stand up and offer him a credit card to soothe his bruised ego. He waited for me to show a single ounce of soft, sisterly hesitation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the distinct, heavy sound of a toxic ecosystem finally collapsing exactly where it was always meant to collapse. Wyatt let out a furious string of curses, turned on his heel, and violently shoved the glass door open. He stormed out into the hallway, the heavy door slamming shut behind him, shaking the window panes. My parents did not chase him. They did not pull out their cell phones to send him a comforting text message. My father simply reached across the polished oak table, picked up the heavy gold pen, and signed his name on the dotted line. The aftermath of that morning was not a magical, heartwarming reconciliation, but it was incredibly real. My parents began making their scheduled escrow payments on the absolute first day of every single month. They were slow, steady, and compliant. They never missed a single installment, and they never once asked for a grace period. Our relationship was completely permanently altered. We did not share tearful, emotional phone calls, but we slowly began to rebuild a cautious, respectful dynamic based entirely on strict boundaries and tangible actions, rather than manipulation and guilt. 8 months after the ink dried on those contracts, Eli and I closed on our very first house. We paid the entire down payment using nothing but the funds we had earned through our own relentless hard work and discipline. Standing on the empty hardwood floor of my new living room, looking out at the quiet street, I felt a profound, sweeping sense of peace. I finally understood the most bitter, yet incredibly liberating irony of my entire existence. My father had spent my whole life telling me to learn the value of true independence. I had simply learned his lessons so perfectly, so flawlessly, that in the end, the entire family was forced to sit down and learn the exact definition of the word from me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.